Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It was a great pleasure meeting you last summer when you first suggested the idea possibly of visiting St. Petersburg. I have been here once before, only once before, so it was a great pleasure to be here again and to talk about a recent, quite recent work that I've just completed with quite a large number of colleagues. I'll say more about that in a moment. I do have a strong constructivist orientation. Much of my work historically is informed by constructivism as an approach to understanding, but as you'll see from this presentation, I actually have, I'm somewhat more eclectic than that, so I may have an orientation that begins with constructivism, but I have a broader interest. And this work, I think, perhaps best expresses my attempt to try to engage the policy sector, to have work and research being done in international relations, theoretical, empirical research, but have it informed by and connected to policy practice and policy process. So in a sense, this is a work that it's a form of applied constructivism. I could say more about that. Professor Roshan said that I would speak and then you could ask questions. If I'm saying something that you would like to challenge earlier, if I've said something that's not clear, if you would like to, if you disagree with something I've said, please feel free to interrupt. That's the way I teach. It's very interactive. I'm happy to take questions as I go. So if there's something that you don't like, and I know that there are many things about sanctions that people don't like, and I'm happy to talk about that. But I'm going to talk, by the way, let me just preface all this. My focus is on United Nations sanctions. So these are sanctions that the Russian Federation approves of. You don't get a UN sanction unless Russia agrees. It may abstain, it may not endorse, but in fact, to have a UN. So I'm talking about what in some legal spheres would be called the range of international, multilateral sanctions measures that are legal under international law. There's a longer debate about that in Geneva and elsewhere, but I'll save that for the questions and answers. So what I want to do is talk about a book I have just published called Targeted Sanctions. It's here, physical, here's the copy. If people are interested, I even have flyers with a 20% discount. So it's actually paperback. This also sells if you wish. I don't know the ruble price, but I do have it in dollars, pounds, and francs. This is a book that is co-edited with two others. Again, he mentioned that I've worked in the past with Sue Eckert. Sue Eckert's a senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University, which is why that logo is there. I was a former director of that institute, which has a long history of studies of the relationship between the United States and Russia, or the United States and the former Soviet Union. But it's also a joint project of the consortium that we created, about which I'll say more in a moment. The third editor is Marcos Torino. He's a recent PhD student, graduate of the Graduate Institute, who is currently a research professor at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Sao Paulo, Brazil. So this is a truly, in some ways, international project. So let me start. I'll go through. I've already held up the physical copy. In previous presentations, all I could do was show a picture of the cover of the book. One of the features that I'm very proud of is the fact that the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan has endorsed the book on the back of the cover. So that in itself is, for people who know his attitude towards sanctions, a bit of an achievement. Let me say a little bit about what we call the Targeted Sanctions Consortium. Now this was a large group project that grew out of, first, the recognition that the United Nations has been imposing targeted sanctions for the last quarter century. I'll say more about this in a moment, but when I say targeted, in general, what I mean is non-comprehensive sanctions. So the UN now has 25 years of experience imposing targeted sanctions measures. But there had, until this project, there had been no comprehensive systematic analysis of the impacts of the UN sanctions, of the targeted sanctions. Were they similar in their impact or their effectiveness? Were they less effective because they were not comprehensive trade embargoes, like the trade embargo imposed on Iraq or the former Yugoslavia, Serbia and Montenegro, or Haiti briefly in the 1990s. There had been no comprehensive or systematic analysis of targeted measures by the UN. And so we formed what we called the Targeted Sanctions Consortium. Now this was a group. The project team was more than 50 scholars and policy practitioners from across the globe who were interested in studying the impacts and the effectiveness of UN targeted sanctions. One of the distinctive features of the project, and this relates to my applied constructivist interest, is the fact that we brought policy practitioners into the room when we designed the research. Quite oftentimes research done in the social sciences is done in research laboratories, in interviews, with field work, with archival work, and at the very end the final product is produced. We maybe write a short policy brief out of a book like this, and then we tell policymakers what they did wrong, typically. That's the sort of one-way communication. This project, we decided we're going to start differently. We're going to invite the policy practitioners into the room as we design the project. And so we really wanted to see, and we literally said, and this included people from the United Nations Secretariat in New York. It included people from member states that are active in drafting sanctions resolutions. It involved people in national capitals responsible for implementation. And so we said to them, as we designed the project, we said, we know what we're going to study. We have our issues, we have our debates in the academy. But as long as we're doing this, are there some issues that you would like us to add to the research? And in fact, it led to an unusual both design and a set of issues, which I'll relate in a minute, that things that we hadn't thought about asking, but in fact now make our work much more accessible to the wider policy community. And the researchers, we have teams studying the Africa sanctions in Africa, East Asia, Europe, North and South America. So it was a fairly broad general project. Unfortunately, no colleagues from Russia, but I hope that after my visit I can, if any of you are interested in it, you can join a larger team of researchers, because I'm afraid sanctions are here to stay as a tool of, I'm not talking about particular ones now, but that as an instrument of policy are here to stay. So we should broaden the community of individual scholars, policy practitioners interested in analyzing what their impacts and effectiveness actually are. Now, I said I'd say something about targeted sanctions. One of the key elements, can I take off my jacket? A little more informal. It's a little warm. So I've already mentioned what we're talking about is a definition in terms of the negative, what they are not, actually. So we define sanctions. Targeted sanctions are not comprehensive sanctions. But in fact, there's quite a variety, a wide variety of different types of targeting of sanctions. So let me just first analytically go through some of the different types. One is individuals. Any one of us in this room could be targeted by the UN, by the EU, by the US, by Russia, added to a list and banned from travel, banned from access to our finances, having a transfer of resources blocked, having an ATM card swallowed. So some sanctions are targeted on individuals. Some are targeted on corporate entities. Now, when I say corporate entities, it's a legal term basically referring to companies, corporations, but another type of corporate entity. So individual firms could be targeted, but you could also target a non-state armed group. You could target the Taliban. You could target UNITA. You could target ISIL. So these are all examples of groups, corporate entities that have been targeted by different actors. Sometimes targeted sanctions refer to not comprehensive sanctions, but sanctions only on one sector of economic activity. So it could be on, let's take some classic examples. You've heard of blood diamonds, okay? Sierra Leone, Angola, there should be sanctions imposed on the export of rough-cut products from a particular country. That would be a sectoral sanction. There have been sanctions on timber in Liberia, sanctions on charcoal in Somalia, sanctions on certain chemicals used in the manufacture of heroin from Afghanistan. So these are all sanctions focused on banning trade in a particular sector only, not a comprehensive trade ban. Then there are sanctions on regions of a country. The United Nations, for example, the sanctions are not against the Sudan. The UN sanctions are against the western provinces of Sudan in Darfur. Or the sanctions on the Democratic Republic of Congo are on the eastern provinces of the DRC. So we can actually see that sometimes targeting means it could be individuals, corporate entities, sectors, or regions, or it could be a combination of them. So if we look at a particular set of targeted sanctions measures in a particular conflict, you might see a collection of different types of targeting. Now this poses a particular analytical problem for those of us trying to talk about the impacts and effectiveness, because we can't simply say comprehensive targeted. We have all these varieties of different types of targeting, and then the question becomes, well, are there some combinations of these measures that have certain types of impacts or effectiveness? I'll say more about that in a moment. Now, our project has two research innovations. Do I need to stay to the mic? Can I walk around? It's fixed, so I should stay here. Okay, I won't walk around there. Normally when I teach, I walk around and I even walk to the back and let people are taking notes on it.
But I think everyone can perfectly hear you even without a mic.
Okay, is it needed for the recording? No? So, okay, then I'll do with that. Okay, wait, okay. Two of the research innovations that we have conducted with regard to this project, there are two things that we've introduced in this project, which are quite significant. First, I think significant. We have focused, yes?
Not related to the recording.
This is fine.
It's not related to the
So you can move.
I can move, okay, fine, okay, perfect. All right, so the first is that many people talk about sanctions in terms of a country. I suppose we could talk about the sanctions on Russia. That would be a country identified with sanctions. We could talk about the Iran sanctions. We could talk about the Somalia sanctions. We could talk about the Liberia sanctions. Most of our discourse, most of our analysis focuses on countries as the unit of analysis, the target country as the unit of analysis. But of course, in some of these cases, countries aren't the focus of the target of sanctions. In some cases, the focus is on a particular regime, Taliban, UNITA, the Contras, forgot the name in Haiti, a different small faction. So focusing on countries is misleading. The other reason we don't focus on countries is that some of these sanctions have been in place for 25 years. Sanctions have been imposed on Somalia since 1991. The problem is that to talk about the effects of the Somalia sanctions, everything has changed. The target has changed. The type of sanction has changed. And the purpose of the sanctions have changed. So rather than look at countries as our unit of analysis, and this is the way most sanctioned scholars look, and if you look at the databases, the research, it's either country case studies or cross-national comparative analyses. We take case episodes, and I'll illustrate this in a moment. We take episodes within country cases. So for example, in the case of Somalia, we've identified 5 discrete episodes over time. The initial sanctions were imposed to protect humanitarian relief agencies in the early 1990s during the inter-clan warfare against Mr. Adid. The sanctions today are directed against al-Shabaab and involve a different set of sanctions measures with a different set of purposes, including everything from piracy to the use of commitment of acts of terrorism in East Africa and elsewhere. So our unit of analysis is not country case, but episodes within country cases. And I'll show you an illustration of this in a moment. The other very important innovation, and this is particularly, I can't resist this in this context, it's very important that we talk about the different purposes of sanctions. Most people think, why do countries impose sanctions? I guess there's a question. Why do countries impose sanctions?
Because someone misbehaved and they don't like it.
Somebody does something we don't like, we want them to change their behavior.
Yeah. But international organizations really like some means of influencing states that are the members of these international organizations, so they can just use some violence against the misbehaving states. So they use some kind of economic sanctions because it's the only way to punish something there.
Oh, so maybe for punishment, and it's usually, it's oftentimes for a particular purpose,
To make the
oftentimes.
state behave.
Sorry?
To make the state behave, not
Yeah.
only to punish, but
Yeah, but behavior, it's
to
a
reach a
ma-
purpose.
or to articulate a norm. I mean, that could be another reason. So oftentimes, most of the focus of sanctions is to coerce a change in the behavior of a target state. So you impose sanctions because you don't like what that state's doing. They've misbehaved, you want to, or you want to force them to change their behavior. There's a certain logic behind this. You impose a sanction, you restrain them in some way, and by not providing them access to markets, access to your markets, access to trade, exports, there's what's called the naive theory of sanctions, that somehow this will result in a coercion of that target to change their behavior. We argue that sanctions have two other purposes, however. And they're not exclusive. They may have multiple purposes simultaneously. A second purpose of sanctions is to constrain a target. Let's say you don't like what a target is doing. You can't force them to change their behavior. But you can make it more costly. You can raise the costs for them. You can make it more difficult for them to engage in proscribed activities. You can make them change their strategy. So let's say a government is engaging in human rights violations against its public. You might not be able to stop that government from engaging in human rights violations against a minority population, but you might be able to make it more difficult for that state to engage in those. Hence, you try to constrain the activities. Or if you think there's no way you're going to change their behavior, let's think about Mr. bin Laden, Al-Qaeda. Well, yes, it would be good if Al-Qaeda had been coerced, but no one thought that they were going to give up the cause. Therefore, the sanctions were designed to constrain Al-Qaeda from having access to resources to commit acts of terrorism. So that's the second purpose. There's a third purpose. Almost all sanctions, in fact I would say all, signal. Sanctions are used to convey signals about norms. So if you say it's misbehavior, you're articulating, I think what you did is wrong. I can't force you to change your behavior. I probably can't even constrain you, but I'm going to send a signal, and it's a costly signal. It's a signal that I feel so strongly about, I'm willing to impose costs on myself. So it's a, quote, costly signal that's being sent. So when we look at, and when we analyze in this project the impacts and effectiveness of UN sanctions, we always differentiate by purpose. Was it was it effective in coercing? Was it effective in constraining? Was it effective in signaling? And I'll say more about the differences. So that's one of our second, I think, important research innovations in the project. Now, I should say that many sanctions resolutions, when we read UN Security Council resolutions, we find that they're simultaneously trying to do all three. But there are sometimes when there are no explicit demands made in the text of a resolution, a demand to change behavior. And so therefore they're not really coercive, they're constraining or signaling. Now, this is the scope of our project. This is what I call the color chart. This is our list of cases, chronologically. From the first case, I'll come back to the ordering in a moment. Former Yugoslavia against Serbia. This was during the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. Imposed in late 1991, Somalia, Libya, all the way down to South Sudan, the most recent UN targeted sanction imposed. So that's our country cases. Notice these line segments. I said earlier our unit of analysis is case episode. So what here's Somalia, I said was 5. There's the first episode, a long, decade-long period of the first episode, 2, 3, 4, and the current episode up to 2015. So this is, each one of these segments is one of our units of analysis. So when we do comparative studies of effectiveness, we're looking at all of these different line segments, basically. Second, just a couple of observations. I'll come back to this in a moment. Notice the predominance of the color yellow. This is categorized by the primary objectives of UN sanctions. Most UN sanctions are intended to get parties to a conflict to cease hostilities or enforce peace agreements. So most of them are conflict situations, many of these in Africa. Red refers to counterterrorism. Note that the UN was involved in counterterrorism sanctions as early as 1992 against Libya. not just Al-Qaeda, which is 1999, and the Taliban, and more recently, of course, Lebanon, and I guess that's it in terms of the more recent ones. Non-proliferation, innovation, 2006, against Iran and the DPRK. Those are a relatively new form of sanctions, now 10 years old, of course. A problematic category called democracy support. This is, we're not quite sure if it's really democracy support or if it's support for a political transition. So it varies. Some members, let's say some permanent members of the council would call it democracy support. Others would say it's intended to, regime change is not usually the goal of the UN, I might add. But of some members of the UN, yes, I will certainly. In fact, it's a dirty secret of the UN research. About 50% of the cases result in regime change, but not because of the sanctions. But it's a correlation, it's one of the issues. But we actually find that Russia in particular is strongly opposed to non-constitutional change of government. So oftentimes Russia backs regime transition support because it doesn't like changes of government that are non-constitutional. Military coups, popular uprisings, you can think of a few cases, I'm sure. So it's interesting how the Council has engaged in that over time as well. And R2P, well, only in Libya too, as we call it, relatively recently. So that's the range of our study, basically, across time. You had a question? Okay. All right. Let me move on, because I can spend hours once I get going on these things. There's the scope of the project. That's just the map of the world. You see that most of the sanctions are imposed against conflicts within Africa, Middle East, North Africa, the exception being Haiti in the west and DPRK in the east, and of course only one case in Europe relatively long ago. This is basically just a map of UN. Again, this is just United Nations sanctions I'm talking about here. This just repeats what I've already said about the UN is primarily by its charter focused on conflict-related sanctions. It's not particular, but counterterrorism, non-proliferation, and democracy support are also important objectives. Now, I'll just briefly go through this. I'll just give you a list of what's in this much larger study. This study, by the way, this started in 2009, so it took us 7 years to get to the point of finishing the book and various things associated with it. There are lots of things in the study. We look at how did the UN become involved? When did it become involved? We look at the political will. What was the vote at the UN? Were there institutional mechanisms created to implement the measures? What were the objectives and purposes? I've already mentioned both of those in earlier slides. Types of sanctions. What types of targeted measures have been applied in each of those 68 now episodes? What's the nature of coordination within the UN system? To what extent does peacekeeping work with mediation, with sanctions, with groups in the field? What's the interaction between UN sanctions and other sanctions regimes, sometimes called unilateral coercive measures? The EU, the AU, by the way, imposes sanctions on its members on a regular basis. It's not just an EU and US thing, I might add. It's something done by the African Union as well. What's the nature of implementation? What's the nature of the impact? How are sanctions evaded? Something that's an interesting set of research results. And what are some of the unintended consequences? So these are all the topics that are in the project as a whole. This is just the table of contents of the book, so I don't really need to elaborate. I'm sure you'll all rush out and now try to find it. Usually what happens is it's illegally copied and put on a website in a country not too far from here. So it's in fact maybe already available, I'm not sure. Though we have people working on the purposes, Security Council dynamics. Many of these names, if you've looked at the sanctions world, you'll recognize them because Clara Patela is one of the leading analysts of EU sanctions, George Lopez of US sanctions, Michael Brochka, again of European sanctions, Alex Boucher and Cathy Clément on coordination issues, Rico Karish and Lorraine Ricard-Martin have long experience in the UN itself. Kim Elliott, Hofbauer, Schotten Elliott, that's the same Elliott, the main database used, and so on. So we have most of the main people in the world working on sanctions as part of the consortium. Peter Wallenstein, who started publishing about sanctions when I was still in high school, Some people who've been around on this issue for a long time. Now let me jump quickly to our principal findings, because it's important to cut to the chase on this. We have many findings. I'll just give some of them, and they'll be open to questions as we go. First, very important finding. We have a chapter on the effectiveness of sanctions, but we're about ready to start saying it's time to stop asking the question, are sanctions effective? Do sanctions work? Because it turns out sanctions are never applied alone. Sanctions are always combined with other measures. And that's across every one of our episodes. We can see threats of force, use of force, peacekeeping operations, ongoing mediation efforts with varying degrees of seriousness or intensity. But mediation, in fact, and sanctions are almost always combined. It's not a choice. People oftentimes say, oh, let's stop imposing sanctions, let's sit down and talk. Well, 9 times out of 10, the sanctions are applied while the conversations are underway. So it's a false dichotomy. It's not a choice. People are actually talking and applying sanctions at the same time. Second, and this is, I mentioned earlier, I alluded to this in the different types of sanctions, that there's a great variety of different types of targeted sanctions, and a point that we've emphasized, because, just an anecdote or maybe an aside, the reason I started studying these measures initially was because I was concerned about the humanitarian impact of comprehensive sanctions. I had a normative interest. I was concerned about the fact that the Iraqi people were suffering the consequences of comprehensive sanctions, and therefore the question of could we use the instrument of economic coercion but in a way that wasn't non-discriminating. What we find is that the targeted measures by definition are more discriminating than comprehensive trade embargoes, but the targeted sanctions themselves differ in their degree of discrimination. So we came up with this chart. It's pretty simple. Individual targeted sanctions are the most targeted. Anybody know how many people are targeted by the UN in Sudan? Any guess?
50?
4. This is a very targeted sanctions regime. 2 on each side of the conflict. 2 in the government, 2 on Darfur. Very targeted. So targeted, you might say they have no impact, no effectiveness. I'll come back to that later. But some are very, very targeted, very, very discriminating. Sometimes we have diplomatic sanctions. Usually it's limits on the size of diplomatic personnel. It might be on communication. Sometimes non-state armed groups like UNITA opened up diplomatic representations in different countries, different cities. They can be sanctioned. Arms embargoes, very popular at the UN. 81% of the time the UN imposes an arms embargo on a conflict, but they're largely limited to the impact on the fighting forces. I mentioned commodity sanctions, diamond, timber, charcoal. They affect some regions more than others. So these are less discriminating than the other types of sanctions. Some sanctions, some sectoral sanctions are non-discriminating. The sanctions applied by the European Union on Iran after 2012 were financial sector and oil sector. That meant that technically they're targeted, but practically they affected the entire population. So these are the least targeted sanctions. Now what we've done is and then of course comprehensive are non-discriminating. So that's basically just the range of measures. Now we've taken this range and we've produced a typology, this is a social science thing to do, of 4 categories of targeted measures, and then comprehensive is number 5. So the most targeted are those, I've already gone through this, we simply code them as a 1. We look at the package of measures in each episode and we say, what's the broadest in place? Is it a category 1, category 2, category 3, or category 4? Category 4 are the EU sanctions on Iran after 2012. So we then start looking at the relationship between these different types of measures and their impacts and their effectiveness. Now one of the things we've been able to do with this, so remember I showed you that line segment, now I'm going to change the colors a bit. This is actually, it's a terrible word, targetedness. How targeted are UN measures over time? Our method now allows us to look over time and see. Now, I rearranged one because we put the comprehensive, we moved Iraq up to the top because the first, Iraq is a wrong reason. We started with former Yugoslavia because it was the first targeted sanction. But then we moved to, when we reanalyzed it, we put Iraq because the comprehensive preceded the targeted in Iraq in 2003. So what this picture tells you is that red and yellow are relatively non-discriminating types of sanctions. Blue, purple, and green are relatively more discriminating. And look at the pattern over time. So the UN, over time, is imposing more targeted measures. And this is actually just a graphic or visual representation of change over time by the UN practices. These are UN Security Council decisions over time. You can see the UN has cooled off. It used to impose comprehensive measures. It doesn't anymore. The last time the UN imposed a new comprehensive trade embargo on a country was 1994. So over 20 years ago. So there may be, this may be called learning. The Security Council may be capable of learning. Other principal findings. All right, now this is where people always want to know, what are the numbers? All right, so we say that on average, targeted sanctions are effective across all three purposes, coerce, constrain, and signal, about 20% of the time.
Not so much.
Not so much. No, no. There's another argument about why are they used, but in terms of their policy contribution, they are present with effective outcomes only about 20% of the time. But they're nearly 3 times more effective in signaling and constraining a target than they are in coercing a change in behavior. So if someone says, we're going to impose sanctions because we want X to change their behavior, I would say fine, but your chances of getting a change in behavior are 1 in 10. Only 10% of the time. It's very difficult. Coercion is very difficult to achieve, and this is not, it's not a finding unique to sanctions, by the way. Because if you look at the work of Robert Pape, who's done a lot of analyses of aerial bombing, both in World War II and more recently, he's found that bombing, you don't bomb people to the conference table. Bombing doesn't work either. So in fact, he has a book called Bombing to Win, and argues basically that it's a false idea that we're going to show force, and therefore we're going to see a change in behavior. Coercion is a very low probability outcome, is basically the point here. But interestingly enough, and here are the numbers, so this are the numbers people usually like to focus. So when it comes to coercing a change in behavior, we say sanctions are effective only 10% of the time. They're ineffective 63% of the time, with regard to the goal of coerce a change in behavior. Constraining and signaling, though, are considerably higher. Still not great across the board, but nonetheless, you're more likely to be able to now, you might say it's easier to signal or easier to constrain than it is to coerce a change in behavior, and that's a priori probably correct. I'm now puzzling over why signaling isn't easier, but that's I've got a recent paper on that subject, but that's another issue. So these are our estimates across all of those cases. Now, let me qualify this. I'm attuned to the point made by policy practitioners that it's very difficult to generalize about sanctions. Each case is unique. Each case is distinctive. Each has its own narrative. It's each story. So we have to be a little bit careful about these kinds of numbers. And we also have to understand that when they're effective, sanctions are associated with other measures. Again, a terrible word, targetedness. I've got another one coming up. This is an interesting preliminary finding. It suggests that as you go, remember that I had the typology category 1, 2, 3, 4 in sanctions. As you look at the relationship between category 1 are never effective. Just targeted sanctions on their own on individuals, we don't have a single case where they've proven to be effective. When it comes to category 2, fairly low percentages. Interestingly, category 3, these are the sectoral measures like on timber, on diamonds, on charcoal, the most effective. When you go to category 4, the important point here is that widening sanctions to make them less discriminating, to hurt an entire population, isn't strengthening the sanctions. At least in terms of our measures of effectiveness, the numbers go down. So more is not necessarily better. You have to reach a critical threshold, category 3, but if you go to category 4, you harm innocent people and you're not likely to get any more effectiveness. So when people talk about policy choice and sanctions, more is not necessarily better. And I can quote some famous political figures who think that more is better, but I think they're wrong. Maybe I'll skip through these because I can go through now a lengthy, frequently people ask, how do you measure effectiveness? This is a methodological question. I'll give it very quickly and give you a couple of examples, but I won't belabor the point. This is where we go quite methodological. What we do is we take an assessment that the effectiveness of sanctions is the product of two separate measures. One, what policy outcome do we see? What happened in the conflict? And two, what was the sanctions contribution to that outcome? Because you might have a change of behavior of a government, but it might have nothing to do with sanctions. So then we can't say sanctions were effective in that case, even if the outcome is what you wanted to see. So what we do is we measure policy outcome on a 5-point scale. And we look again, we separate coerced, constrained, and signal. And we give a coding of 1 in each episode if the target is completely intransigent. No change in behavior. In fact, sometimes even increases this. Number 5 would be full compliance with the terms of a UN Security Council resolution. That almost never happens, by the way. We have a few 4s, but not very many 5s. Constraint, non-observable. Number 5, considerable constraints experienced by the target. In fact, we look for when the target says the sanctions are preventing us from being able to do things. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. Signaling is when there's unclear, vague signaling from the UN and no stigma attached to the target. 5 is when norms are clear and there's full stigmatization of the target. Now that's one set of measures. That's the policy outcome for coerced, constrained, and signal. Then we look at effectiveness. What's the sanctions contribution? Here we have a 6-point scale. Sometimes sanctions make things worse. For example, sanctions against the regime in Haiti in the 1990s, 93, resulted, in fact, the sanctions were increased from targeted to comprehensive. So it was a huge, went from category 3 to category 5 on our scale. What happened? The government decided there's nothing to lose. And they started systematically assassinating members associated with Mr. Aristide, the first democratically elected government in Haiti's history. So sometimes sanctions make things worse. Sometimes they have no impact whatsoever. No sanctions contribution. Sometimes minor because others are much more significant. Sometimes immodest, they've contributed or reinforced other measures. Sometimes they're necessary but not sufficient. And finally, they're significant. So what we do is we take these measures and we say, to be effective, you have to have a 4 or a 5 on policy outcome, and the sanctions contribution has to be at least a 3. Yes?
Are there any examples of 4 or 5 sanctions, like which stage?
I mean, which sanctions in terms of outcome, 4 or 5?
Yeah.
Yes, I'll give you 3 examples in a minute. Okay, let me give you 3 right now. Effective coercion, Libya in the 1990s. Policy outcomes of 4, because the suspects were turned over, trials were conducted outside of Libya, compensation was provided to the victims of Pan Am and UTA flights, terrorism was renounced by the Gaddafi government, but not on the terms of the original UN, so that's a 4. So there's a concrete example of policy outcome. Sanctions contribution, well, it's not the only thing going on. There's a suspension of sanctions. Interestingly, it's like Iran. It wasn't the application of sanctions, but the lifting of sanctions that produced the breakthrough. Which means actually sometimes even after sanctions are in place, it could be their lifting that actually triggers a breakthrough. And I think the same thing happened with Iran last year. So the suspension was significant to reinforce legal procedures already underway in domestic and international courts and to get the compensation. So that becomes one of our effective cases of coercion. We only have 6 in our entire sample of 68. Effective constraint, Liberia. Policy outcome, Charles Taylor complained that the arms embargo denied Liberians the right to defend themselves, and the timber sanctions had starved Liberia of revenue. So there's clear recognition. And the sanctions were not the only thing going on. The target acknowledged them, but changes on the ground, particularly military changes on the ground, and Nigerian diplomatic pressure were also very important. So the sanctions can't be given too much credit for that outcome, but there is clear restraint. I mean, Charles Taylor literally said, the timber sanctions have made it, we can't export a toothpick out of Liberia. So that's how effective those measures were. Effective signaling. This is the case of Jonas Savimbi, the head of UNITA, who was singled out in the text of a UN Security Council resolution and blamed for the breakdown of the coalition government that he had signed up to participate in. So this is when the UN literally said, okay, you personally are responsible for the continuation of the conflict, and that's strong stigmatization, pretty clear isolation. And the sanctions contribution, again, there was a significant enforcement of the UN sanction because of the Ambassador Fowler report, but also strong diplomatic pressure present. So there's a combination of measures. Sanctions, as I said, never work alone or in isolation. So those are some examples. I have, at the very end, I can show you a list of all of the effective episodes by coerced, constraint, and signal. And then you can see which ones we coded. By the way, all of our coding and our rationales are publicly available because we've developed an app under this project. So if you haven't downloaded Sanctions app yet, I'll say more about that later, but it's free. So as long as you don't have a BlackBerry. And Nokia, I think, can now handle it. Now, other findings, I've already mentioned this. Arms embargoes are common, 87%, I said 81. But they're ineffective when they're applied alone. And we found this is true of all sanctions. If you just apply one type of sanction, we don't have a single case where we've seen effective outcomes. And sometimes the UN doesn't have enough consensus to do anything more than to apply a travel ban, as it did in the case of Guinea-Bissau a few years ago. But when it does that, they're not effective. The UN, of course, loves arms embargoes. It makes sense. The United Nations, it's peace, it's members, it's the scourge of war. The charter begins with references to ending the scourge of war. It makes sense that the first thing you do with a conflict is you impose an embargo on arms that are fueling that conflict. So it makes logical sense. They just don't work alone. Commodity sanctions, when appropriate, are highly effective. And effective sanctions are commonly associated with at least 3 and closer to 4 different types of targeted measures being imposed simultaneously. So when I now look at how serious is the UN about a particular conflict, I look at the number of types of targeted sanctions it's imposing, because I can see from that mix both how serious they are and how likely they are to be effective. A couple of other findings. What are controversial ones? UN sanctions tend to be not the first sanctions applied, but the second. Oftentimes sanctions by the UN follow sanctions that have been applied by the US, the EU, or the African Union, the AU. So the UN isn't the first responder to conflict with sanctions, it actually follows sanctions by other actors. UN sanctions remain to this day highly targeted. The one exception was Libya after 2011, when the UN had a lot of difficulty. The panel of experts that was looking at the Libya sanctions could not differentiate between the Gaddafi family assets and the Libyan government assets. And because of that, they basically applied sanctions to the Libyan Investment Authority and to the central bank, which were pretty close to financial sector sanctions in the case of Libya. Additional findings. Targeting is important, but the list of targets have to reflect the purposes. Sometimes, and there's some research, interesting research being done in Sweden now by Peter Wallenstein and his colleagues, looking at the text of the UN resolution and the actual list of people designated. And sometimes there's a mismatch, and so the message is sent but not very clearly. If you have too many, too few, or the wrong targets, it undermines the credibility of the UN's action. And this is a perennial problem. Anyone who studies the UN system knows everyone talks about one UN. Getting the UN to work as a coherent body, it's hard enough to get mediation and sanctions people who are across the hall from each other in the Department of Political Affairs to talk with each other. So this is a constant problem within the UN system, and it often undermines the sanctions' effectiveness. Now there are findings, something I really did not expect to see, secondary sanctions. Now this refers to sanctions that are applied to another country, a neighboring country, in a particular conflict. It's rare that they're applied, but when they are, they're always effective. It's interesting. It's an N of 2, so it's a very small sample. I wouldn't argue from this, but it's basically the cases of Liberia with regard to Sierra Leone and Eritrea with regard to Somalia. And unilateral regional sanctions often can be confusing, complicated to implement, and can actually undercut UN sanctions. And this is really a reference to Iran. I'm happy to talk about any of the cases if you wish. Now, I made a reference to the fact that UN sanctions are never applied alone or in isolation. This is a very small sample, but it is actually indicative of the relationship between sanctions and other policy instruments. So this really defines my current research project. I'm looking at the relationship between sanctions and mediation. Why? Because, and with the support of the Swiss government, I might say, I'm interested in the fact that we only have 6 examples of successful or effective coercion. 4 of them are associated with enhancements of negotiation. So my question now is, what's the relationship between sanctions and mediation? And I've got a recent report done for Humanitarian Dialogue, which explores this question in terms of when sanctions complicate mediation and when sanctions can actually complement. And that's something that very little research has been done today. The second is constraining. Effective constraint in 15 of our cases, it tends to be associated quite highly with the use of force. Again, not terribly surprising that it's sanctions that are limiting resources and selective application of force together result in the constraint of the target. And with regard to signaling, we see associations with the use of force, but also legal measures. What I mean by legal measures are a referral to the ICC, a referral to the special courts, ICTY, ICTR, or the special court on Sierra Leone. So these kinds of legal measures enhance the power of the UN signal. So what we're now looking at in terms of research is the associations between sanctions and other types of instruments being applied simultaneously, because it's time to stop talking about sanctions on their own. Sanctions are applied always in combination with these other measures. Challenges. Let me conclude with a couple of challenges here. First, another terrible word. I said I was going to invent terrible words. Comprehensivization, or the recomprehensivization, even worse. One of the challenges I mentioned earlier, I showed how the UN has been, in its design of sanctions, that chart I had when it was red and yellow and then turned sort of cooler, blue and green, on this change over the last 25 years. So the UN is designing more targeted measures. The problem is keeping targeted sanctions targeted. There are a couple of reasons for this. They're targeted in design, but they're broadened when they're implemented. And that's because there are 2 translations. A sanctions resolution is crafted in New York by the Security Council. It is then, under Chapter 7, legally applies to all 193 member states. Each member state has to interpret into its domestic law the application of those measures. Hence, states translate them into restrictive measures. Now, states might make them broader, they might make them narrower, so this could go either way. But oftentimes, states are not clear, they send out unclear communications, and another level of broadening of implementation is the private sector. If you look at the case of private, let's say, targeted financial sanctions, one of the most popular instruments, your banks make a decision as to their compliance with these measures. And they may have to choose, well, we can either do what's called due diligence and check all of our lists and use name recognition software to see if we have any accounts that have been designated, or we can just take all the accounts associated with Iran because we don't have the time to go through each and every Iranian account. Let's just block Iran for now. And some institutions do that in terms of compliance. Interestingly, Swiss institutions, I know well, apply not just UN sanctions, but EU sanctions. Well, there's a technical with regard to Russia I can talk more about, because Switzerland is not sanctioning Russia, as you probably know. But it's also applying sanctions. It takes the US list as well. There's no legal reason why a Swiss-based financial institution should apply the US list, except the US might retaliate against that financial institution and block it from access to the US market and impose large fines on it. So therefore, the extraterritorial application, and this happens, BNP Paribas is the most famous, and it can mean a fine of $9 billion. So anyway, private sector implementation, widens these measures because they're risk averse. They're compliant, but they're also risk averse. So it's very hard to keep these measures targeted. Another challenge is the coexistence of multiple sanctions regime. Iran was the target of UN sanctions, of US sanctions, of EU sanctions, and other voluntary restrictive measures from Korea, Japan, even India and China. That means that from the target standpoint, we're just being sanctioned. Everybody's against us. Which means the effectiveness of the signal from the UN gets diluted because there are all these other things going on. So what the negotiations in Geneva and elsewhere over Iran were about were lifting not just the UN sanctions, but all the other sanctions. And this means that sometimes there's language being used in Security Council sanctions, I'm getting a little technical now, called member states are called upon to exercise vigilance with regard to the implementation of these measures. Sounds like a good, constructive contribution. What some countries do is they say, well, the UN sanctions are the floor upon which we will build other measures. So the European Union justified its measures on Iran in terms of UN Security Council resolutions. That was the floor upon which the EU supplemental measures were applied. Russia and China tend to argue, no, no, no. The UN is the ceiling of what is legitimate. So the UN is what is allowed. Anything beyond that is illegal or illegitimate or both. And that's an ongoing debate. We call it the floor-ceiling debate within the UN Security Council. It's a debate amongst the P5 with some pretty well-known views, with some variation depending on the conflict. Other challenges. Targeting individuals. We talked about this briefly before I came upstairs. The challenges of individual designations. When the UN first started, I've been doing this long enough. I started working on targeted sanctions over 15 years ago. In the very first round of individual targeting, and you may not believe this, but no one at the Council or in the Secretariat ever thought about the implications of individual targeting for individual human rights. It seems kind of amazing because they were preoccupied with the humanitarian disaster and conflict and the consequences in Iraq. So individual, well, okay, there may be some rights violations, but it's so much better than comprehensive sanctions, so let's just move ahead. Nobody thought through the implications, and that led to a whole series of legal challenges, primarily in Europe, but in courts around the world, in the US, in Turkey, in Pakistan as well. There's a very famous businessman named Mr. Qadi. I have Qadi 2 and its implications. Mr. Qadi went through the European courts not once, but twice. In the end, won a settlement. By the time he won his settlement, he'd already been delisted by the UN and by the EU, but that's another matter. Nonetheless, it has important implications for the development of due process with regard to individual targeting. And this is an area which really interestingly combines international law and international relations. It's a fascinating case study. But I think in the area of terrorist financing restrictions, we've entered what I would call the realm of the permanent exception. Now you can know I'm entering a little more constructivist and critical literature about the fact that we're in, as I said in, I think, the counterterrorism financing, a war against, a global metaphorical war against a tactic has no end. So the war on terrorism is open-ended. There's most all of these other conflicts we have termination points. There's a settlement, there's a change of regime, there's a change of policy, life goes on. Terrorism is a tactic, and a global metaphorical war against that tactic is open-ended. And so the UN now finds itself in the unusual policing situation. It's not like we're going to negotiate our way out of it. It's endless. It's open-ended. And the question is the UN Security Council the right place to do this? So we've actually raised the question in the conclusion of our book, is it time to rethink the 1267 regime? 1267 refers to the UN Security Council resolution on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Now it's been renamed, it's now the ISIL Al-Qaeda Committee. Things changed, hence it's a new episode in our court. Final point, just about automatic extensions of regimes. It's always easier, this is a classic point about bureaucratic behavior, it's always easier just to carry through. We did that last year, let's do it again this year. Resolutions now have a termination point, 1 year renewable, which is good. The point is, it's much easier just to roll them forward. So what happens, excuse me, is that they're automatically extended, which weakens the signaling and makes it very difficult to end sanctions regimes. We did have one end this year, however, so we've gone from 16 to 15. The sanctions, UN sanctions against Côte d'Ivoire have come to an end. Almost. Even Iran, by the way, the UN still has sanctions on Iran, even though if you go to the UN website, you won't see that. I'm going to skip the policy recommendations and go to your questions. I just want to conclude with a reference to a couple of policy outputs. We have 5 different things. If you're interested in research from this project, this is just the introduction. This is sort of like a menu. I've given you a sampler of what's here. We have a practitioner's guide. That's for policy practitioners. It's a little out of date. We last published this in November, end of 2013. So that's a little dated. We hope everyone now just buys the book. That's much more current. We have 2 databases, and these are available. Any of you can access these databases. I'll show you the link in a moment. We have a quantitative database on all 63 of the episodes that I had in the earlier slide. We have 68 now, but that's another story. 63, and for each one of those episodes, we have 296 variables. That's a big matrix. That's 20,000 cells. That's a lot of data on lots of things. That's publicly available now. It was released when the book came out 2 months ago. We also have a qualitative database. The qualitative database is probably more interesting. It has case sketches of every single episode, including some key aspects, including our evaluation and why we evaluate it as effective or not. Then we have policy briefings we've done in New York, London, Yerevan, Ottawa, Washington, Brussels, Geneva, and Kingston. Some of these 2, Yerevan and Kingston, are places I travel. I talk to foreign ministries in different places, so these are Jamaica and Armenia. And scholarly publications, I mentioned the book 3 times now, and Sanctions app. If you don't have Sanctions app, it's free, downloadable, just hit Sanctions. If you've got an iPhone, if you have an Android, it's free, downloadable. It's also available on the web under sanctionsapp.com. Now, Sanctions app is a political tool that we created for the Security Council. Again, funded by the Swiss government, because Switzerland believes in democratizing global governance. If I can make that a strong statement. And one way to do that is to give information to practitioners in real time. So if you open Sanctions app and you're sitting in a meeting in New York, you're representing your elected member of the Security Council, and the US has just tabled a resolution, and you say, I don't like that paragraph, our app will give you access to alternative language that can qualify, can condition, can limit, can provide an exception, and you have that information in real time. It also has the entire qualitative database. So if you're sitting in a meeting, as I found myself with the Sudanese ambassador recently, and he makes, I thought, an outrageous statement about the situation and how Sudan had been victimized by the UN, and I said, Mr. Ambassador, you said, what did we do? This is what you did. And I read from the app directly what Sudan had done. He didn't say a word after that. So knowledge is power. That's the point. And knowledge in your hand can be very powerful. And that's the idea of democratizing. Our modest goal is we're trying to change how the Security Council works. So Sanctions app is free. We also have one feature on it that's quite useful for the panels of experts, but also it's called Analogy Finder. So this is an interactive app. It's like it's based on a recipe menu. You check off what your conflict is, what types of sanctions you want, what kind of effectiveness you want. It filters through our database and it suggests to you what's the most effective analogy to that particular problem. And it has search functions as well throughout the entire database. So this is all available. We update it annually up in the mountains in Switzerland every summer in August. We talk about all these dreadful conflicts and we update them, and it's used quite extensively. We had great endorsements from the elected members of the Security Council, but I can tell you the permanent members use it as well. So for more information, contact me for the web version of the app. It's on sanctionsapp.com, and or visit the Graduate Institute for the database. So that's, I've given you more than I should have. I took almost an hour. Sorry about that. I do tend to go on about these things, but I've been obviously enthused about the subject for a while. Any questions I'm happy to take at this point.